So first, a little history on the universe, the Earth, and our solar system. The universe is roughly 15 billion. It's closer to 14.7 billion years old. Our solar system is young compared to the universe. It's only about 4.6, 4.7 billion years old, the Earth and the solar system. And life on Earth started about 3.8 billion years ago. Humans, modern humans, have only been around for about 200,000 years. So compared to the universe and the Earth and even life on Earth, we are a very new species. Well, you have to know these exact numbers? No. But you should know about how long ago life started, about how long ago the Earth and the solar system were formed. And like any unit in biology, it's all about the key terms. So these are some of the evolution key terms. The first one is a gene pool. It's all the alleles of all the genes and all the individuals of a population. So for humans, blue eyes, that allele, boom, that's in our gene pool. Dimples, dimps, boom, that allele, that's in our gene pool. So all the genes, all the alleles that make humans humans, that is in our gene pool. Now our gene pool, for most organisms, it's always changing. So some alleles in our gene pool become more frequent and some become more scarce depending on if they're good or bad for the organism. Do they give them a better chance to survive? Those alleles will become more common in the gene pool. Traits or alleles that make it harder to survive, those alleles will become more scarce in the gene pool. The next one is species. Now it just says a group of similar organisms that can mate and produce healthy, fertile offspring. But you also need to know species all share the same gene pool. So a group of species all have the same gene pool. They all have the same collection of alleles in their population, which makes up their gene pool. Speciation, even if you don't know, even if that definition wasn't there, you could probably figure out what that means. It's just a process of two or more species branching off from a single species as a result in changes in genetic equilibrium. So in a nutshell, it's just basically the process of forming new species from one species. And the last key term on this page is variation. And that is just genetic diversity. No matter what the species is, humans, dolphins, monkeys, bacteria, everything, nothing is exactly the same. There's diversity. There's variation amongst the traits and the genes. There's differences within the gene pool in a population of organisms. All right, so just a slide that shows that there are some variation. These two little guys right here, that's the San Joaquin Valley kit fox, native to right here in the San Joaquin Valley. You don't really see them around here too much, but if you go down into Kern County around Bakersfield, you might be lucky enough to see one of these little guys. But you can see there's variation. They're not all exactly the same. This guy is more black and white, where this is the more traditional San Joaquin Valley kit fox with his tan-colored fur and his darker colored legs. These are all sea snails, same species, but you can see they're not all exactly the same. Some are bright yellow, some are yellow and black, some are more white. This guy's got stripes, so there's a lot of diversity. These are the same species of frogs, but once again, they are not all exactly the same. This dude is yellow. This guy's kind of orangish. This guy's red and black. So even though they're the same species, there's variety. There's variation. I don't know why I have corn in here. That's a bad example because these guys were made through artificial selection, selective breeding. But you can see that there are varieties, even though this is all corn. There's different varieties. There's variation within the species of these organisms. Okay, so a very important term in evolution is the term adaptation. Since in a population of organisms there's a variety or there's variation of alleles in the gene pool, therefore there's a variation or a variety of traits. Some of these traits can give organisms an advantage. They give them a better chance to survive or reproduce. And any trait or feature that gives you an advantage to survive and reproduce, that's called an adaptation. Now that could be the color of your fur. So for a rabbit living in the desert, being brown is probably advantageous. It's probably an adaptation because if you're brown, it's probably tougher to see you. But if you're a rabbit living at the North Pole, it's probably better to be white because living in the snow, it would be harder for a predator to see you if you are white. Now these adaptations can also be behavioral. It doesn't have to be physical like fur color. It can also be like certain organisms are just naturally afraid of everything, and when they get startled, they run. So like, say, gazelles or maybe deer. If you see a deer, for the most part, they get scared and they run away. Well, why? Because deer that aren't afraid and they stick around, if, say, a bear is there, RIP. Those deer don't last very long. Those are the deer that die. They get eaten by the bear or the wolves or whatever. So they do not pass on that trait of being unafraid of things. But the deer that do have the natural adaptation to run away from things they don't know, that is advantageous. That's an adaptation because those deer are more likely to survive and reproduce, and their little baby deer will also run away when they see something that they don't like. And here's some examples of adaptations. Obviously, the long neck of the giraffe. That is an adaptation. The longer your neck, the better. Because this giraffe right here, he can eat grass, or not grass, but leaves off the tree here. He can eat them here. And he can reach up and eat them way up here. Now, when times are okay, when there's a lot of rainfall and there's a lot of trees for them to feed on, even a giraffe with a tiny little neck, he'll be fine because there's plenty of stuff for him to eat. But if, say, there's a drought, the giraffes with the longer neck that can eat leaves, both low, medium, and really high up in the trees, these guys have a much better chance of getting enough food, a much better chance to survive, therefore, a much better chance to have baby giraffes. And if they have long necks, they will have a better chance to pass on that trait to their baby giraffes. So, over millions of years, giraffes' necks, they started out not very long, but they got longer and longer and longer and longer. Here is, of course, a Venus flytrap. Its adaptation is that it uses photosynthesis to make its energy, but it doesn't require very good soil. It doesn't need good soil to get nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. It can get that by eating flies. This guy's adaptation is, I think, pretty obvious. That is not a leaf. That is a walking leaf bug. So that is actually an insect that, looks almost exactly like a leaf. How's that advantageous? Well, obviously, if you're a bird, birds don't eat leaves. So a bird probably will look right over that guy and not try to eat it. This is a cactus. It's got little thorns, spikes growing off it. That's got two advantages. It's an adaptation because nothing's going to want to eat it because you don't want a mouthful of thorns. Plus, if you have leaves like this, you give off a lot of water. Well, when you're in the desert, you do not want to give off a lot of water. So these little tiny thorns don't give off much water, so it allows them to hold in a lot of water. This guy right here, this is a beetle. He looks normal, but he's a dung beetle. What does he eat? He eats elephant droppings, the feces of elephants and other animals. How's that an adaptation? Who else wants to eat elephant droppings? Pretty much nobody. So this guy right here pretty much has no competition for food. Other than other dung beetles, no other organisms besides like bacteria have any interest in eating elephant or zebra or whatever droppings. And that obviously gives him a better chance to find his food, survive, and reproduce. Okay, another key term is fitness. Now, in humans, usually fitness means, are you in good shape? But when it comes to evolution, no. It's a measure of an organism's ability to survive and reproduce within its ecosystem or within its environment. For example, a rabbit that is white living in the Arctic Circle would have higher fitness than a rabbit that is black living in the Arctic Circle. The reason why? It'll be harder to see a white rabbit in the snow than it is to see a black rabbit. So in a nutshell, fitness is how likely is an organism to pass on its genetic information to its offspring. How likely is it for that organism to reproduce, and how many offspring will it produce? If it produces a lot of babies, a lot of offspring, it's a better chance that that organism's traits will move on to the next generation. So in the wild, sometimes fit could mean the fastest. If you're a cheetah, you want to be fast because that is your adaptation. That's your advantage. If you're a faster cheetah, you have a better chance to catch the gazelle. If you're a really, really big bear or a big lion, the biggest lions, the male lions, they fight for the right to mate with the females. So the bigger you are, the better chance you are going to mate and pass your genetic information on to your offspring. But fit doesn't always mean biggest, fastest, strongest. It just means who is most well adapted to its environment. So like a little example, a polar bear, it's strong, but if you put a polar bear in the desert, its fitness would be extremely low. Its chances of surviving and reproducing to pass on its genetic information to the offspring would be extremely low. It'd basically be zero. Because first of all, it's not going to find another polar bear to mate with. And if it did, polar bears aren't adapted to living in the desert. So those polar bears wouldn't survive. So polar bear's fitness in the desert would be low, whereas fitness in the Arctic Circle is very high. So give an example of how a weak or slow organism might actually be more fit than a big and strong one. Well, like that leaf bug, the bug that looked like a leaf. Its advantage, if it was fast, if it liked to move around a lot, that would actually not be an adaptation. That would be a disadvantage because unless it's really windy, leaves don't move around very much. So for that leaf bug, it's actually an adaptation. It's advantageous to stay still, to be really, really slow. Okay, so which of the following is most fit according to evolution? A, you got a fish that is the biggest, the fastest, but it cannot produce any offspring. All right. Then we have a fish that is medium-sized and slower, but mates twice to have many, many offspring. Which of those would be the most fit? I'll pause and hear your answer. Hopefully you picked fish B. Since fish A, even though it's big and fast, since it produces no offspring, its traits, its genes will not be passed on to the next generation. That fish's traits, its genes will stop. It's done. But this guy right here, since it has many offspring, it has a good chance that some of its little babies will survive and pass on its traits to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. So the fish that is medium-sized and slower will have higher fitness than the big, fast fish that cannot produce any offspring. Because fitness is all about, can you pass your traits? Can you pass down your genes? Can they survive in the gene pool? Okay, so evolution. The biological theory which states that species undergo genetic changes over time. Genetic changes over time. Or B down here. Anytime there's a change in the frequency or the percentage of alleles in the gene pool of a population, that's evolution. And if you had to write a little short paragraph on what evolution is and how it occurs, population of organisms have different physical traits. They all have little minor differences, color, speed, size, whatever. They all have little differences. Well, the differences are caused by variations or differences in their DNA. They have different genes in their DNA. Well, over time, the organisms with traits, the best traits or the most adaptations in their environment, they tend to survive and reproduce. Since they have a better chance to survive and reproduce, their genes, their alleles, which means their traits, are more likely to be passed on to future generations within that species. All right, so a name you're going to have to know in evolution, Charles Darwin. With DNA, we had Watson and Crick. With genetics, we had Gregor Mendel. And now with evolution, we have Darwin. He was a British naturalist who worked on the ship called the HMS Beagle. I'm not going to ask you that, but pretty much everybody knows that. Well, he traveled from England, which is not an easy voyage, around the Cape of Good Hope, and to the little tiny islands of the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. Well, he looked at these birds, these finch populations, and he noticed that they were very, very similar, but they did have differences. Some of their beaks were like really narrow, some were kind of medium, and some were very large. And he hypothesized, he guessed, that it was one species of finch that flew to the Galapagos Islands, and since they landed in different areas of the islands, and the islands had different environments, different conditions, over time, that one species of finch evolved to have different traits. Okay, so here's Darwin's finches that he saw on the Galapagos Islands. The main thing he noticed was like their difference in their beaks. Some had long, slender beaks, some had like really broad, fat beaks, and some were kind of like in between. Well, when there was nuts on the ground, finches that had to crack open nuts, it was an adaptation to have a big, thick beak, because if you had a real skinny beak like that, they couldn't crack open the nuts. But finches, they ate insects. It was an adaptation. It was an advantage to have medium beaks. And for ones that had to like reach in and grab insects inside of trees, like little holes, it was advantageous for them to have long, slender beaks so they can get their beak inside that hole to grab their food. So this one species of finch, over thousands and thousands of years in the Galapagos Islands, they adapted to have these specific traits which were advantageous in their particular ecosystem that they inhabited in the Galapagos Islands. All right, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.